It had two main guns, a crew of 7 men, and a silhouette so tall it could be spotted from the next county. And it just might be the most important and most hated tank of the entire war. This is the story of a weapon born from desperation, a machine so full of contradictions that it was hailed as a savior in one desert while being cursed as a death trap on another continent. We're going to unravel the complicated, controversial, and absolutely critical tale of the M3 Lee, the ugly duckling of American armor that held the line when no one else could. In the year 1939, as the world slid irrevocably towards global conflict, the United States Army was in a sorry state, especially when it came to armored warfare. While Heinz Guderian's panzer divisions were demonstrating the terrifying new reality of blitzkrieg, America's main battle tank was the M2 medium. The M2 was a machine that looked like a land-bound battleship, bristling with no fewer than 8 machine guns, but its main armament was a piddling 37mm cannon. It was a relic of a bygone era, a moving pillbox designed for infantry support, not for the lightning-fast tank-on-tank duels that were defining the battlefields of Europe. When France fell in the summer of 1940, a wave of panic washed over the American military establishment. They watched, horrified, as German Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs, armed with effective 50 and 75mm guns, swept aside everything in their path. The United States had nothing, absolutely nothing, that could compete. The immediate and desperate need was for a medium tank armed with a 75mm gun. A gun of that caliber could fire a devastating high-explosive shell, perfect for obliterating anti-tank guns and enemy fortifications, and it also had the kinetic energy to punch through the armor of most contemporary tanks. The problem was, America had never built a turret big enough to house such a weapon. Designing and tooling up a factory for a brand new wide turret tank would take years, and the Allies did not have years. They had months, maybe even weeks. So a typically American solution was proposed, a stopgap, a compromise, an imperfect answer delivered now, rather than a perfect answer delivered too late. Ordnance Department engineers took the chassis and powertrain of the existing M2 medium tank as a starting point. It was a known quantity, and its engine and suspension were reasonably reliable. Since they couldn't fit the 75mm gun in a turret, they made a radical decision. They would mount it in the hull, specifically in a sponson on the right-hand side of the vehicle. This was a massive compromise right from the start. A hull-mounted gun has a very limited traverse, meaning the entire tank often had to turn to aim the main weapon. It was an awkward, inefficient solution, but it got the big gun onto a mobile platform, and it got it there fast. To provide some anti-tank capability in a more flexible mounting, the designers stacked a smaller secondary turret on top of the main hull, equipping it with the old 37mm gun. To top it all off, some versions would even feature a third, smaller machine gun cupola on the very top of that. This layered, almost wedding cake design is what gave the tank its absurdly tall and unforgettable profile. It stood nearly 10.5 feet high, a towering target on any battlefield. The armor was another area of compromise. While it was thick for its time, up to 51mm in some places, it was assembled with rivets, thousands of them. This was an older construction method, faster than welding, but with a deadly side effect. When a non-penetrating high-explosive shell struck the outside of the tank, the sheer concussive force could cause the rivets on the inside to shear off, turning them into red-hot metal projectiles ricocheting around the crew compartment. This phenomenon, known as spalling, could kill or maim the crew without the shell ever breaching the armor. And there was a lot of crew to maim. The M3 Lee required a commander, a 37mm gunner and loader in the top turret, a 75mm gunner and loader in the hull sponson, a driver and a radio operator who also sometimes manned a machine gun. That's a staggering 7 men, all crammed inside this riveted steel box. By October of 1940, the design was finalized, and by August 1941, the first M3 medium tanks began rolling off the assembly lines at arsenals and factories across the nation, built by titans of industry like Chrysler and the Baldwin Locomotive Works. It was a freak of a machine, a multi-turreted monster born of desperation. Nobody thought it was perfect, but it was what America had, and it was about to be thrown into the crucible. Across the Atlantic, the British were fighting for their lives in the deserts of North Africa. Their own tank designs, like the Crusader, were fast and reliable, but they were armed with the puny 2-pounder, a 40mm gun that was woefully inadequate. The 2-pounder fired only solid armor-piercing shot. It had no high-explosive round. This meant British tanks struggled to deal with German anti-tank gun screens. They could knock out Panzers if they got close enough, but the German 88mm anti-aircraft guns, used in an anti-tank role, were slaughtering them from ranges where the British tanks simply couldn't fight back. When the United States passed the Lend-Lease Act in March of 1941, offering to supply its allies, the British were first in line, pleading for a tank with a bigger gun. The M3 was the only option. The British took one look at the American design and requested a few changes. The most significant was the removal of the high-profile commander's machine gun cupola in favor of a simpler, lower-profile cast turret. This new turret also housed a radio, allowing the tank commander to communicate effectively without also having to man a machine gun. In honor of their primary benefactor, the British designated their modified version the General Grant, while the original American version retained the name General Lee. In the spring of 1942, over 150 M3 Grants arrived in Egypt, just in time for one of the most critical phases of the Desert War. To the British tankers of the 8th Army, who were used to their undergunned Crusaders, the Grant was a revelation. It was big, it was loud, and it had a 75mm cannon that could fire a 14-pound high-explosive shell over 3 miles. They nicknamed it the Egyptian Charmer. The Grant made its dramatic combat debut in May 1942, at the Battle of Gazala. As Rommel's Afrika Korps swept around the British flank, they ran headlong into the newly equipped 4th Armored Brigade. The German panzer crews were shocked. They were engaging British tanks from ranges where they assumed they were safe, only to see their own vehicles erupt in flames. The Grant's 75mm gun could outrange and outgun the short-barreled cannons on the Panzer III and the early models of the Panzer IV. For the first time, the British could stand off and engage the Germans on equal or even superior terms. The high-explosive shell was a game-changer. A single Grant could sit in a defensive hull-down position, with only its turret visible, and systematically destroy the German anti-tank guns that had plagued the British for so long. Of course, the tank was far from perfect. Its high silhouette made it an easy target in the flat, open desert. The limited traverse of the main gun was a serious tactical liability. A Grant commander couldn't just crest a dune, spot a target, and fire. He had to coordinate with his driver to swing the entire 10-foot-tall, 30-ton vehicle into position, all while trying to present the smallest possible target to the enemy. It demanded a whole new level of crew coordination. So what would you have done in that situation? Would you prefer the flexibility of a fully traversing turret with a weaker gun, or the raw power of a hull-mounted cannon that required you to expose your entire vehicle to aim? For the British tankers in 1942, the answer was clear. They would take the firepower. At the pivotal Second Battle of El Alamein, the M3 Grants and the first of the M4 Shermans formed the backbone of Montgomery's armored force, punching holes in the German lines and paving the way for a victory that would turn the tide of the war in North Africa. For the Desert Rats, the awkward American import was a war winner. But while the British were calling it their savior in the desert, halfway across the world, Soviet tankers were about to give it a very, very different name. In November of 1942, American forces landed in North Africa as part of Operation Torch, and they brought their own M3 Lees with them. This was the tank's debut in American hands, and the results were decidedly mixed. By late 1942, the Germans were fielding more and more tanks with long-barreled, high-velocity 75mm guns of their own. The M3's armor, which had seemed adequate against earlier Panzers, now felt dangerously thin. Its height made it a magnet for enemy fire, and its riveted construction was proving to be just as lethal as the designers had feared. American tankers grimly noted how a solid hit would fill the compartment with a storm of deadly steel fragments. And this, in my opinion, was its single greatest design flaw. It's one thing to be killed by an enemy shell piercing your armor. It's another entirely to be taken out by your own tank, essentially turning into a giant, inward-firing shotgun. The Lee could get the job done, but it was a nerve-wracking vehicle to fight in, and its crews quickly learned to respect its many vulnerabilities. If the American experience was mixed, the Soviet experience was an unmitigated disaster. Under the same Lend-Lease program that supplied Britain, over 1,300 M3 Lee tanks were shipped to the Soviet Union. The Soviets were desperate for any tanks they could get to stem the German tide on the Eastern Front, but their initial enthusiasm for the American machine quickly turned to bitter disappointment, and then to outright hatred. Almost every single one of the M3's design flaws was brutally amplified by the unique conditions of that theater of war. The vast, open steppes of Russia offered no place for the 10-foot-tall tank to hide. Its gasoline engine was notoriously thirsty and prone to catching fire when hit, a stark contrast to the diesel engines favored in Soviet designs like the T-34. The tracks were too narrow, giving the heavy tank poor traction in the deep Russian mud and snow, leading to frequent breakdowns. The Soviets were masters of simple, brutally effective tank design. The T-34 was revolutionary, with its sloped armor, powerful diesel engine, and effective 76mm gun in a fully rotating turret. It was operated by a crew of 4, sometimes 5. To them, the M3 Lee, with its 7-man crew, ridiculously high profile, and archaic hull-mounted gun, seemed like a joke. A deadly, impractical joke. They derisively nicknamed it the BM-7, which stood for Bratskaya Mogila na Semerik, translating grimly to a common grave for 7 brothers. Soviet tankers found the layout of the tank to be horrendously unergonomic. The separation of the main gun in the hull from the commander in the turret made coordination a nightmare. Reliability was abysmal. The powerful aircraft-derived radial engines were not designed for the grit and grime of ground combat and required constant, meticulous maintenance, a luxury the Red Army could rarely afford. While a few saw limited, begrudging use in quieter sectors or during the Battle of Kursk, the vast majority of M3s sent to the Soviet Union were quickly relegated to training duties or simply abandoned. For the Red Army, the American stopgap was not a savior. It was a coffin. Yet, the M3's story has another, often forgotten chapter, one that took place far from the deserts of Africa and the steppes of Russia. In the dense jungles and volcanic islands of the Pacific Theater, the M3 Lee found an unexpected new lease on life. Here, the nature of the war was completely different. Large-scale tank versus tank battles were rare. The primary opponent was the Imperial Japanese Army, whose own tanks, like the Type 95 Hago and Type 97 Chiha, were lightly armored and armed with small-caliber guns. Against these opponents, the M3 Lee was an absolute monster. Its 37mm turret gun was more than capable of defeating any Japanese tank it encountered, while its powerful 75mm main gun was the perfect tool for the real job at hand, blasting Japanese bunkers, machine gun nests, and fortified positions to pieces. In the claustrophobic jungle environment, the M3's weaknesses became far less relevant. Its high silhouette was masked by the dense foliage. The limited traverse of its main gun was less of a problem when engaging stationary targets like pillboxes. Its riveted armor was still a concern, but the Japanese lacked the kind of high-powered anti-tank guns the Germans deployed in Europe. Here, the M3 could function as a mobile assault gun, a role it was surprisingly well suited for. U.S. Army and Marine units used them effectively in campaigns from Makin Atoll to Okinawa. The Australian Army also received several hundred M3 Grant tanks, which they used with considerable success in the brutal fighting in New Guinea. At the Battle of Bunagona, Australian Grants were instrumental in cracking open the formidable Japanese defenses that had held up infantry for weeks. In the Pacific, the awkward, multi-gun tank that had been cursed by the Soviets proved to be a powerful and decisive weapon. It's a perfect illustration of a fundamental military truth. The effectiveness of a weapon is defined not just by its design, but by the context in which it is used. The M3Lee's production run ended in December of 1942, after just over 6,000 units had been built. Its frontline service with the American and British armies was relatively short. By mid-1943, it had been almost entirely replaced by its famous successor, the M4 Sherman. And this is where we find the M3's most important and enduring legacy. It was never meant to be a war winner. It was always, from its very conception, a temporary solution, a bridge to something better. The M3 program was a vital learning experience for American industry. The same factories that struggled to assemble the Lee's complicated riveted hull learned the techniques of mass production that would allow them to later churn out of thousands of Shermans. More importantly, the M3 Lee and the M4 Sherman were mechanically very similar. They used the same Continental radial engine, the same transmission, and the same vertical volute spring suspension system. In essence, the M4 Sherman was a new, vastly superior upper hull and turret placed on a modified and improved M3 chassis. The lessons learned from the M3's cramped interior, its vulnerable armor, and its awkward gun layout directly informed the brilliant, practical, and war-winning design of the Sherman. So let's be clear, without this ugly, awkward, and often hated tank, there is no M4 Sherman. Period. The Sherman program would have been delayed by at least a year the Allies simply did not have. So how do we judge this strange machine? The Soviets who died in it were right to hate it. The British who were saved by it were right to praise it. The Americans who fought in it were right to be wary of its flaws. The M3 Lee was a tank of profound contradictions. It was too tall, too vulnerable, and too complicated. But it was also the tank that put a 75mm gun in the hands of Allied soldiers in 1942 when nothing else could. It was the stopgap that filled the gap. It held the line in the desperate days in the desert and served as the indispensable industrial prototype for the weapon that would help liberate Europe. It may not have been the tank the Allies wanted, but for a crucial moment in history, it was the tank they desperately needed. The history of warfare is filled with these kinds of fascinating compromises. The M3 Lee is a perfect example of a weapon that looks terrible on paper, but performed a vital role that history often forgets. What other ugly duckling weapons do you think deserve more recognition for getting the job done when it mattered most? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy diving into the stories of these unsung heroes of military history, make sure you report for duty and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next operation. General out.